The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence House as King Charles III sat in his private study, surrounded by the weight of centuries-old traditions and the pressing demands of modern monarchy. The leather-bound chair creaked softly as he shifted, his weathered hands clasping a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea. Outside, the world continued its relentless pace. But within these walls, time seemed to move differently, measured not in minutes, but in the careful consideration of decisions that would ripple through generations. Charles had always understood the delicate balance required of his position. Every word, every gesture, every relationship carried the potential to strengthen or weaken the very foundation upon which the British monarchy stood. For decades, he had navigated these treacherous waters with the skill of a seasoned diplomat, but today felt different. Today, the weight of a decision that had been building for months pressed down upon him with an almost physical force. The door to his study opened with the softest whisper, and his private secretary, a man whose discretion was as legendary as his efficiency, entered with a purposeful stride. In his hands, he carried a folder that Charles recognized immediately. The Parker Bowles family file had grown considerably thicker over the years, filled with newspaper clippings, security reports, and detailed analyses of public sentiment. What had once been a simple collection of background information had evolved into something far more complex and concerning. "Your Majesty," the secretary began, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality that came from years of delivering both good news and bad to the highest levels of government. "The situation we discussed last week has developed further complications." Charles set down his teacup with deliberate care, the fine china making no sound against the saucer. He had been expecting this conversation, had been preparing for it in the quiet moments between his official duties. The reports had been accumulating for months, each one adding another layer to a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The Parker Bowles family, Camilla's relatives, had been causing ripples in the carefully controlled pond of royal life. What had started as minor indiscretions and embarrassing headlines had gradually escalated into something far more serious. Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son, had been involved in a series of business ventures that, while not technically illegal, existed in the gray areas of ethical conduct. His restaurants and food ventures had been accused of exploiting workers and engaging in tax avoidance schemes that, when exposed, reflected poorly on the royal family by association. Laura Lopes, Camilla's daughter, had faced her own challenges. Her marriage to Harry Lopes had been troubled for years, with rumors of infidelity and financial impropriety that the tabloid press followed with relentless enthusiasm. Their children, while still young, had already begun to attract unwanted attention from photographers and social media, creating security concerns that stretched the royal protection detail thin. But it was the extended Parker Bowles family that presented the most significant challenges. Cousins and distant relatives had begun leveraging their connection to the Queen Consort for personal gain, appearing at events they had no business attending, using the family name to secure business deals, and generally behaving in ways that violated every unwritten rule of royal association. Charles had initially hoped that time and careful management would resolve these issues. He had instructed his staff to work quietly with Camilla's family, providing guidance and support, where appropriate, and gently discouraging behavior that might prove embarrassing. For a while, this approach had seemed to work. The headlines had become less frequent, the business ventures more carefully vetted, and the public appearances more appropriate. However, recent events had shattered this fragile peace. Tom Parker Bowles had been photographed at an exclusive gambling establishment in Monte Carlo, surrounded by individuals with questionable reputations and connections to international money laundering operations. While Tom himself was not accused of any wrongdoing, the photographs had appeared in newspapers across Europe, with headlines questioning whether the Queen Consort's son was associating with criminals. More damaging still had been the revelation that Laura Lopes had been secretly receiving substantial loans from foreign nationals, including a Russian oligarch whose assets had been frozen by the British government as part of sanctions related to the conflict in Ukraine. The money had been used to fund her art gallery in London, and while she claimed ignorance of the source of the funds, the timing and amounts raised serious questions about due diligence and potential conflicts of interest. The final straw had come just days earlier, when Andrew Parker Bowles, Camilla's ex-husband and the father of her children, had been arrested for drunk driving. While Andrew had maintained a respectful distance from royal affairs since Charles and Camilla's marriage, his arrest had inevitably drawn media attention to the entire family network. The fact that he had been driving to a charity event that bore the Queen Consort's patronage only made the situation worse. Charles opened the folder and began reading the latest security assessment. The language was clinical and precise, but the implications were clear. The Parker Bowles family connections had become a security risk and a public relations nightmare. Intelligence services had identified at least 3 instances where foreign agents had attempted to approach family members, seeking to exploit their royal connections for espionage purposes. The financial entanglements were equally concerning. A forensic audit had revealed a complex web of business relationships and financial obligations that created potential leverage points for hostile actors. While no evidence suggested that any family member had intentionally compromised royal security, the pattern of poor judgment and questionable associations created vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Public opinion polling, conducted discreetly by the palace's communications team, revealed a troubling trend. While Camilla herself remained relatively popular, particularly among older demographics, her family's behavior was beginning to affect perceptions of the monarchy as a whole. Focus groups consistently expressed concern about the royal family's judgment in managing their extended connections, with some participants questioning whether the monarchy was becoming too entangled with ordinary citizens who lacked the discipline and training necessary for royal association. Charles closed the folder and walked to the tall windows that overlooked the garden. The roses that Camilla had planted during their first year of marriage were in full bloom, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray uncertainty that had settled over their relationship in recent months. He thought of her dedication to her royal duties, her genuine warmth with the public, and the stability she had brought to his life after years of turmoil. But he also thought of the institution he had inherited from his mother, the crown that represented something larger than any individual, including himself. Queen Elizabeth II had spent 7 decades carefully maintaining the delicate balance between the monarchy's human elements and its symbolic power. She had understood that personal happiness, while important, could never come at the expense of the crown's integrity. The afternoon light began to fade as Charles continued his contemplation. He knew that the decision he was about to make would send shockwaves through the palace, the government, and potentially the Commonwealth realms. But he also knew that his duty as king required him to place the long-term interests of the monarchy above personal considerations, no matter how painful that might be. When Camilla returned from her afternoon engagements, she found Charles in an unusually somber mood. They had been married long enough for her to recognize the signs of deep contemplation, the way he would retreat into himself when facing particularly difficult decisions. She had seen this expression during the early days of his reign, when the weight of kingship had first settled upon his shoulders. Over dinner, served in the intimate dining room they preferred for private meals, Charles began to broach the subject that had been weighing on his mind. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a man who understood that everything he said would be remembered and analyzed. He explained the security concerns, the public relations challenges, and the long-term implications for the monarchy's reputation. Camilla listened in growing silence, her face betraying little of the turmoil that Charles knew must be building within her. She had always been remarkably composed under pressure, a quality that had served her well during their courtship and marriage. But as Charles continued to explain the situation, he could see the subtle signs of distress that only he would recognize. The conversation continued late into the evening, with Charles carefully laying out the evidence and Camilla asking pointed questions about the accuracy of the reports and the motives of those providing them. She defended her family where appropriate, acknowledging their mistakes while questioning whether they warranted such drastic action. As midnight approached, Charles finally articulated the decision that had been forming in his mind throughout the day. The Parker Bowles family would need to be formally separated from any association with royal activities. No more official events, no more patronages, no more access to royal properties or resources. It would be a complete and very public rejection of everything that connected them to the crown. The silence that followed his words seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by the distant chiming of Big Ben carried on the night wind. Camilla's face had gone pale, and for the first time in years, Charles saw vulnerability in her expression, that reminded him of the uncertainty they had both felt during the early days of their relationship. "You're asking me to choose," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Between my family and my duty." Charles reached across the table, covering her hand with his own. The gesture felt both intimate and somehow formal, carrying the weight of their personal relationship and their public roles. "I'm not asking you to choose," he replied. "I'm telling you what must be done for the good of the crown. Your family will always be your family, but they cannot continue to be part of our official life." The implications of this decision extended far beyond the immediate family dynamics. It would require a complete restructuring of security arrangements, a careful management of public communications, and delicate negotiations with various government departments that had become accustomed to working with extended royal family networks. More personally, it would fundamentally alter the character of Charles and Camilla's marriage. Since their wedding, they had worked to blend their families and create a sense of continuity between their past lives and their royal future. This decision would sever those connections in the most public and permanent way possible. As the night wore on, the full scope of what Charles was proposing began to sink in. Palace staff would need to be briefed, security protocols would need to be updated, and official announcements would need to be carefully crafted to explain the changes without creating additional scandal. The media would inevitably speculate about the reasons behind the decision, leading to weeks or months of intense scrutiny and analysis. The emotional cost would be equally significant. Camilla would be forced to maintain distance from people who had been part of her life for decades, including her own children. While Tom and Laura would not be completely cut off, their access to royal events and their ability to trade on royal connections would be severely limited. Charles understood the cruelty inherent in his decision, but he also understood the alternative. Allowing the current situation to continue would inevitably lead to more serious scandals, potentially compromising national security and certainly damaging the monarchy's reputation beyond repair. The institution he had inherited from his mother was larger than any individual, including himself and his wife. As dawn broke over London, Charles and Camilla remained in their dining room, surrounded by the remnants of a meal that had grown cold hours earlier. The decision had been made, but its implementation would require careful planning and flawless execution. The silence between them had evolved from shock to acceptance, and finally to a grim determination to do what duty required, regardless of personal cost. The first calls would be made within hours, setting in motion a series of events that would reshape the British royal family and send ripples of shock through palaces around the world. The king had chosen the crown over family, duty over personal loyalty, and the institution over individual happiness. History would judge whether his decision was wise or cruel, but there could be no doubt about its necessity or its consequences. The first sign that something extraordinary was happening came at precisely 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, when the palace's senior communications director received an urgent call from Clarence House. The voice on the other end belonged to the king's private secretary, and his tone carried the gravity of someone delivering news that would reshape the royal landscape forever. Within the hour, an emergency meeting had been convened in the secure conference room deep within Buckingham Palace. The attendees included the most senior advisors from across the royal household, the private secretary to the sovereign, the keeper of the privy purse, the master of the household, and representatives from the various protection and security services that safeguarded the monarchy. Each person in that room understood that their presence meant they were about to become privy to information of the highest sensitivity. The king's decision was presented with clinical precision. There would be no room for misinterpretation or gradual implementation. The Parker Bowles family would be immediately and completely severed from any official connection to royal activities. Security clearances would be revoked, invitations to official events would be withdrawn, and any business or charitable associations that traded on royal connections would be terminated. The practical implications were staggering. Tom Parker Bowles had been scheduled to appear at no fewer than 12 official events over the coming months, including a high-profile charity gala that bore the Queen Consort's patronage. Laura Lopes had been involved in organizing an art exhibition that was to be opened by senior members of the royal family. Extended family members had various commitments and associations that would need to be unwound with surgical precision. Security arrangements presented perhaps the greatest challenge. For years, the protection detail had monitored and occasionally protected members of the Parker Bowles family during high-risk events or when intelligence suggested potential threats. Withdrawing this protection would need to be done gradually to avoid creating security vulnerabilities. But it would also need to be completed quickly enough to demonstrate the finality of the king's decision. The communications strategy required equally careful planning. The palace's relationship with the British media was built on decades of mutual understanding and carefully managed information flow. Major changes in royal protocol were typically announced through established channels, with background briefings provided to trusted journalists who could be relied upon to present the information in an appropriate context. However, the nature of this decision made traditional communication strategies problematic. Any official announcement would inevitably prompt questions about the reasons behind the king's choice, leading to speculation and investigation that could prove more damaging than the original problems. The palace communications team concluded that a strategy of managed silence would be most appropriate, allowing the changes to become apparent through absence rather than announcement. Meanwhile, at Clarence House, Camilla faced the devastating task of informing her family about the king's decision. The first call was to Tom, who was at his restaurant in London preparing for the lunch service. She had rehearsed the conversation in her mind throughout the sleepless night, but when she heard her son's voice, the carefully planned words seemed inadequate to convey the magnitude of what was happening. Tom's initial reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by anger. He had built his career carefully, leveraging his culinary talents while being mindful of the responsibilities that came with royal connections. While he had made mistakes, he argued, they were no worse than those made by countless other public figures who had never faced such severe consequences. The conversation with Laura proved even more difficult. As the daughter who had always been closest to her mother, Laura had embraced her role as an unofficial royal family member with enthusiasm and dedication. She had genuinely believed that her art gallery and cultural activities contributed positively to the royal family's public image. Learning that these activities would now be seen as liabilities rather than assets was a blow that struck at the core of her identity. The extended Parker Bowles family presented a more complex challenge. Many of them learned about the decision through the withdrawal of invitations and the cancellation of previously arranged meetings. Cousins who had been looking forward to attending Ascot found their names quietly removed from guest lists. Business associates who had expected royal patronage for upcoming ventures received polite but firm letters explaining that circumstances had changed. Within the royal household itself, the decision created ripples of uncertainty and concern. Staff members who had worked closely with Camilla's family found themselves in the awkward position of implementing policies that seemed to contradict years of careful relationship building. The king's decision was not questioned directly, but the sudden shift in protocol created confusion and required constant clarification. The queen consort herself faced the most challenging adaptation. For the first time since her marriage, she found herself truly isolated within the royal structure. While Charles remained supportive and understanding, their relationship now carried the weight of his decision in every interaction. Camilla had always prided herself on her ability to bridge the gap between the royal family's formal requirements and the more relaxed approach of her own family background. Public events became exercises in careful choreography. At a charity luncheon the following week, Camilla arrived alone, without the usual small entourage of family members who had often accompanied her to such events. The absence was noted by experienced royal watchers, who began to speculate about potential family illnesses or scheduling conflicts. The media's initial response was cautious. Royal correspondents had learned over the years to distinguish between temporary adjustments and permanent changes in royal protocol. However, as days passed without any appearance by Parker Bowles family members at events where they would normally be present, speculation began to build. The first major test of the new protocol came during a state visit from the President of France. Such visits typically included extensive social programming, with various members of the extended royal family attending dinners, receptions, and cultural events. The complete absence of Camilla's family from these activities was noticed immediately by diplomatic observers and protocol experts. Behind the scenes, the French delegation made discreet inquiries about the absence, concerned that they might have inadvertently caused offense or overlooked important cultural sensitivities. The British diplomatic team found themselves in the awkward position of explaining that there were scheduling conflicts, without providing details that might create diplomatic complications. The security implications of the king's decision began to manifest in unexpected ways. Intelligence services had grown accustomed to monitoring potential threats against extended royal family members, and the sudden withdrawal of this protection created gaps in their surveillance networks. Several foreign intelligence agencies, unaware of the changed circumstances, continued to attempt contact with Parker Bowles' family members, leading to confusion and potential security breaches. Tom Parker Bowles found his business ventures under increased scrutiny as investigators and journalists sought to understand the reasons behind his sudden exclusion from royal events. Restaurant reviews began to focus more heavily on his establishment's financial practices and employment policies, creating pressure that had not existed when he enjoyed royal protection. Laura Lopes faced similar challenges in the art world, where her gallery's credibility had been closely tied to her royal connections. Collectors who had previously been eager to work with her began to distance themselves, uncertain about whether her changed circumstances indicated legal or financial problems that had not yet become public. The extended Parker Bowles family experienced varying degrees of difficulty adapting to their new circumstances. Some members, who had been uncomfortable with the level of public attention that came with royal association, found the change liberating. Others, whose social and professional lives had become deeply intertwined with royal connections, struggled to maintain their previous status and influence. Within the royal household, staff members began to adapt to the new reality with the professional discretion that was their hallmark. However, the emotional toll of the change was evident in the subdued atmosphere that characterized official events. Camilla's usual warmth and spontaneity seemed diminished, replaced by a more formal and careful approach that reflected the isolation she now faced. The king himself showed no outward signs of regret or uncertainty about his decision. During public appearances, he maintained his usual composure and dedication to royal duties. However, those closest to him noted a new tension in his demeanor, a weight that seemed to press down upon him even during moments of relaxation. Private conversations between Charles and Camilla became increasingly focused on practical matters rather than personal ones. Discussions about upcoming events, official duties, and protocol requirements filled the spaces that had previously been occupied by family news and casual conversation about relatives and their activities. The psychological impact of the decision extended beyond the immediate family to the broader network of friends and associates who had become accustomed to the social and professional opportunities that came with royal connections. Invitations to private parties and informal gatherings became less frequent, as hosts uncertain about the new protocol chose to avoid potential embarrassment. As weeks passed, the full scope of the king's decision became apparent to those within royal circles, even as the general public remained largely unaware of the dramatic change that had occurred. The palace's strategy of managed silence was working in terms of avoiding immediate scandal, but it was also creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and speculation that would prove difficult to manage in the long term. Professional relationships that had taken years to build were severed with surgical precision. Charitable organizations found themselves in the awkward position of having to distance themselves from individuals who had previously been valuable advocates and fundraisers. Business partnerships were quietly dissolved, and social connections were allowed to fade through benign neglect rather than dramatic confrontation. The emotional cost of this careful dismantling was most evident in Camilla's transformation from a confident, family-oriented royal consort to a more isolated and formal figure. Her public appearances maintained their professional quality, but observers noted a loss of the spontaneous warmth that had characterized her approach to royal duties since her marriage. The silence that had fallen over the palace was not the absence of sound, but rather the presence of unspoken understanding about a decision that would forever change the character of the British royal family. It was a silence that spoke of duty chosen over personal loyalty, of institutional preservation over individual happiness, and of the terrible loneliness that sometimes accompanies the exercise of absolute authority. As the second month of this new reality began, the full weight of the king's decision continued to reverberate through every aspect of royal life, creating changes that would prove impossible to reverse, and consequences that would extend far beyond the immediate family circle affected by his choice. 3 months after the king's fateful decision, the full consequences of his rejection of Camilla's family began to manifest in ways that no one at the palace could have entirely predicted. The carefully managed silence that had initially contained the story was beginning to crack under the pressure of persistent media speculation and the inevitable human drama that accompanies such profound personal and institutional changes. The first major break in the palace's wall of discretion came from an unexpected source. Andrew Parker Bowles, Camilla's ex-husband and father of her children, gave an interview to a respected journalist from The Times. While he maintained his characteristic diplomatic restraint, his carefully chosen words painted a picture of a family that had been profoundly affected by circumstances beyond their control. Andrew's interview was a masterclass in saying everything while appearing to say nothing. He spoke about the natural evolution of relationships within complex institutional frameworks, and the understanding that personal connections must sometimes yield to broader responsibilities. However, his tone and the timing of the interview sent a clear message that the Parker Bowles family's absence from royal events was neither voluntary nor temporary. The media response was immediate and intense. Royal correspondents who had been tracking the gradual disappearance of Camilla's family from official events suddenly had a framework for understanding what they had been observing. Within hours, every major newspaper was running stories about the Parker Bowles problem and speculating about the reasons behind the king's apparent decision to distance the royal family from his wife's relatives. Buckingham Palace found itself in an impossible position. Confirming the stories would require explaining the security and reputational concerns that had prompted the king's decision, potentially exposing sensitive intelligence information and creating new scandals. Denying the stories would be transparently false given the obvious absence of Parker Bowles family members from events where they would normally be present. The palace's solution was to issue a brief statement acknowledging that arrangements regarding extended family participation in official events are constantly reviewed and adjusted based on various factors, including security, assessments, and scheduling considerations. The statement satisfied no one and confirmed everything, creating exactly the kind of speculation and investigation that the original strategy had been designed to avoid. Within days of the media coverage, previously unknown details about the Parker Bowles family's financial and personal difficulties began to surface. Journalists, now aware that there was a significant story to be uncovered, began investigating the business ventures, personal relationships, and social connections that had initially prompted the king's concerns. Tom Parker Bowles found himself at the center of a media storm that threatened to destroy the culinary career he had spent decades building. Investigative reporters uncovered details about his business practices that, while not illegal, painted a picture of someone who had consistently pushed ethical boundaries in pursuit of profit. Staff at his restaurants began speaking anonymously about working conditions and payment practices that contradicted the public image he had carefully cultivated. The gambling photographs from Monte Carlo were republished alongside new information about Tom's financial difficulties and his associations with individuals involved in money laundering operations. While he maintained his innocence of any wrongdoing, the constant media attention made it impossible for him to operate his businesses effectively. Within weeks, 2 of his restaurants had closed, and his television contracts were quietly terminated. Laura Lopes faced even more serious consequences when the full extent of her financial entanglements became public knowledge. The loans from Russian oligarchs were revealed to be part of a complex web of international transactions that potentially violated sanctions regulations. While she claimed ignorance about the source of the funds, financial investigators began examining whether her art gallery had been used as a vehicle for money laundering operations. The revelation that the Queen Consort's daughter might have been unknowingly involved in sanctions violations created a diplomatic crisis. The British government found itself in the awkward position of investigating potential criminal activity by a member of the extended royal family, while foreign governments questioned whether the monarchy's security protocols were adequate to prevent exploitation by hostile actors. Camilla herself became the subject of intense speculation about her role in the decision to distance her family from royal activities. Royal biographers and constitutional experts debated whether she had willingly agreed to sacrifice her family relationships for the sake of the monarchy, or whether she had been forced to choose between her personal loyalties and her royal duties. The psychological toll of this public scrutiny was evident in Camilla's increasingly strained public appearances. The warm, spontaneous personality that had made her popular with the British public seemed to fade, replaced by a more guarded and formal approach that reflected the isolation she now experienced even within her own family circle. Private conversations between the king and queen consort became increasingly difficult as the media coverage intensified. Charles found himself in the position of having to defend a decision that he knew was necessary, while watching its implementation cause profound pain to the woman he loved. Camilla, meanwhile, struggled to maintain her support for a husband whose choice had effectively destroyed her relationships with her children and extended family. The impact on Tom and Laura was particularly devastating. Both had built their adult lives around the assumption that they would be part of the royal family's extended circle, with all the opportunities and responsibilities that entailed. Suddenly finding themselves not just excluded but actively distanced from their mother's new life created emotional wounds that would prove difficult to heal. Family gatherings that had been a regular feature of Camilla's life became impossible to arrange. The security protocols that now governed her every movement made casual visits with her children impractical, while the media attention surrounding the family made public meetings inadvisable. Phone calls and private messages became the only form of communication, and even these were constrained by the knowledge that any contact could potentially become public knowledge. The broader Parker Bowles family network experienced varying degrees of disruption as the media investigation expanded. Cousins and distant relatives found themselves subjected to unexpected scrutiny, with journalists investigating their business dealings, personal relationships, and financial arrangements in search of additional scandal. Some family members chose to speak publicly about their experiences, creating additional waves of controversy and speculation. Others retreated from public life entirely, cutting off contact with media and, in some cases, with other family members who they blamed for the crisis that had engulfed them all. The international implications of the king's decision became apparent when Commonwealth realm governments began conducting their own reviews of royal family security protocols. The revelation that hostile foreign actors had attempted to exploit royal connections raised questions about whether similar vulnerabilities existed in other monarchies and how they could be prevented in the future. Intelligence agencies in allied countries began sharing information about attempts to compromise royal family members, leading to a broader international investigation into the use of monarchy connections for espionage and money laundering purposes. The Parker Bowles case became a template for understanding how seemingly innocent family relationships could be exploited for hostile purposes. Within the palace itself, the king's decision created lasting changes in how royal protocols were managed. New procedures were implemented for vetting family connections, monitoring financial relationships, and assessing security risks associated with extended family members. The informal, family-oriented approach that had characterized the early years of Charles and Camilla's marriage was replaced by a more institutional and security-conscious framework. Staff members who had worked closely with the Parker Bowles family found their roles significantly altered, or, in some cases, eliminated entirely. The warm, inclusive atmosphere that Camilla had brought to royal events was replaced by a more formal and distant approach that reflected her isolation from the family connections that had previously anchored her identity. The long-term constitutional implications of the king's decision began to emerge as legal scholars and constitutional experts analyzed the precedent that had been set. The complete severance of family ties for security and reputational reasons established a new standard for royal behavior that would affect future generations of the monarchy. Young members of the royal family, including the Prince and Princess of Wales's children, would grow up in a world where family loyalty was explicitly subordinated to institutional requirements. The romantic notion of monarchy as an extension of family relationships was replaced by a more clinical understanding of the crown as an institution that could demand the sacrifice of personal connections when circumstances required it. Public opinion polls revealed a complex and divided response to the revelations about the king's decision. While many expressed understanding for the security concerns that had prompted his choice, others questioned whether the monarchy's demands for perfection were compatible with normal human relationships and family loyalties. The queen consort's approval ratings, which had been steadily rising since her marriage to the king, began to decline as the public struggled to understand her role in the family separation. Some viewed her as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, while others questioned her judgment in maintaining relationships with family members whose behavior created security risks. As the crisis entered its fourth month, attempts at reconciliation began to emerge from unexpected quarters. Religious leaders and family counselors offered to mediate between the king and the Parker Bowles family, arguing that the Christian principles of forgiveness and redemption should take precedence over institutional considerations. However, these well-intentioned efforts foundered on the practical realities of royal security and the irreversible nature of the damage that had been done. The media coverage and investigation had created a permanent public record of the family's problems, making it impossible to return to the previous informal arrangements, even if the king had been inclined to reverse his decision. The silence that had initially fallen over the palace evolved into something more complex and enduring. It was no longer just the absence of Parker Bowles family members from royal events, but a fundamental change in the character of the monarchy itself. The institution had demonstrated its willingness to sacrifice personal relationships for its own preservation, establishing a precedent that would echo through generations. Charles and Camilla's marriage, while surviving the crisis, was forever changed by the decision and its consequences. Their relationship now carried the weight of a choice that had preserved the monarchy's integrity while destroying the family connections that had given their personal life meaning and joy. The love that had sustained them through decades of public scrutiny and criticism now existed within the confines of an institution that had demanded the ultimate sacrifice from both of them. The story of the king's rejection of Camilla's family became a defining moment in the modern history of the British monarchy, illustrating the eternal tension between personal loyalty and institutional duty that lies at the heart of royal life. The silence that fell over the palace would endure long after the immediate crisis had passed, a permanent reminder of the price that must sometimes be paid to preserve the crown's ancient dignity and continued relevance in an increasingly complex and dangerous world.